Hello and welcome to the test screening. I'm Billy.
I'm Chloe. We're two film school graduates and cinephiles who can't seem to get enough of the big screen.
So now we're bringing you our weekly insights into the biggest releases, hottest topics and forgotten classics every Monday.
Hello everybody and welcome back to the test screening. My name is Chloe.
And my name is Billy.
Kick off our episode today, we're going to talk about streaming services. So streaming services have grown massively over the last couple of years. We've seen multiple new ones popping up, especially, Paramount Plus, Apple TV, Netflix, Disney Plus in recent years as well. And I just wanted to get your perspective on streaming services in general, what they mean for the industry, but also there are so many of them now. How should where should people put their money? Where is the good content coming from? It seems so thinly spread at the moment. Is there a direction that you can see it all going in where that isn't the case anymore? I know I've asked you just three huge questions.
Well, I do agree with you about the idea that streaming is just spread so incredibly thin at the moment. I mean, there's a particular grievance I have where, shows or film extensions of TV shows that were cancelled before their time, kind of unfairly, and that I was a fan or follower of, has then been released on a streaming service that, I don't want to get a free trial of Paramount Plus just so I can watch the Ray Donovan film to cap off the series. I mean, I'll probably have to at some point because I do want to know how it ends, considering it got cancelled after 7 seasons. But it does just feel like, with things like Apple TV Plus and Paramount, and also I know we spoke a bit last week about HBO Max, it's almost like there isn't the quantity of big heavyweight shows on those services isn't large enough to really justify the price tag. I think the quality of some of the programming from something like Netflix is so much more variable. A lot of the Netflix style rom-coms, and there's that new one, Obsession, which just does not appeal to me at all. You get some real duff stuff on there, but you also get, absolute heavyweights like Stranger Things and Sex Education and shows like that. I mean, if you had to put your money on one, I would still say that for consistently producing fairly high quality stuff and having a large amount of value for the money you're paying for the service, as opposed to alongside, the amount of quality programming you're getting, I think Netflix is still kind of top of the pile in that respect, especially with the original films they do with things like Marriage Story, The Irishman, and other big films from heavyweight directors like those. And Amazon Prime still has, I think, a lot of good stuff on there as well. But the fact that people are getting Apple TV Plus to watch Severance or Ted Lasso is, I think, is indicative of the fact that, well, not to slight those shows because they're both amazing series, and I'm sure we'll talk about at the very least Ted Lasso at some point. But it just means that, I always think if people are getting a streaming service just to watch one show, I'm like, I don't think that bodes well for, the overall output of that service. I think it kind of, the writing's on the wall there.
I would say that Apple has been creating more stuff that's been intriguing me recently. There was that Taron Egerton series Blackbird that I really wanted to see. Slow Horses, another Taron Egerton film, Tetris. I kind of wanted to, that intrigued me. Severance is a fantastic show, and I do like Ted Lasso. So I feel like Apple is it was the underdog at one point, but now it's becoming of a different beast. It's becoming kind of the home of less content, but a quality that is quite reliable, I'd say, in comparison to something like Netflix that does seem to kind of churn it out. And they have some amazing successes, and then they have some absolute doozies on there that are not worth the time of day,
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well, because when you have something that feels curated, like you say, like Apple TV, or there's less output, but it is consistently high quality. Whereas something like Netflix is churning out some quite, zeitgeisty series, that are probably actually quite cringeworthy, like, You or Obsession or a lot of those Heartstopper or things like that.
Oh no, Heartstopper's good.
But yes,
That stuff is sweet.
maybe I'm being a bit too cynical on that one. But I
Okay,
think things
okay, some of it was cringy, but it had a good heart.
it did have a good heart. It had more heart than other things I've seen on there. But something like Severance, which has had such massive Emmy success. I think it's up for 11 Emmys at the next set of awards. I feel like nobody I know's seen it. I mean, I know we've both seen it, but I can think of 2 or 3 other people I know who have also watched it, which feels like such a shame because it's such a creative premise and it's so cinematic and has such high production values, and obviously it feels like watching it. It feels like you can tell that a lot of money's gone into it. It kind of feels like it's almost being relegated to a smaller, narrower audience.
I recommend it to a lot of people. I recommend Severance to, and whenever anybody asks me for a TV show recommendation, I usually do go to Severance because it's such a good concept. You get people are always, whenever I tell people the concept, they're like, ooh, I might watch that. And then you're like, oh, what's it on? Apple TV. And they're like, oh. Because they know
I've got to get another one.
Exactly. And I do just think that having, again, talking about things being spread so thin, people are turning to illegal streaming more and more because they can't keep up with it. They can't keep up with, who can afford all these streaming services? It's crazy.
Yeah, not everyone can be me and wants to put all their paycheck on ability to watch things at the cinema
Exactly.
and streaming services. I don't blame anyone for that.
You are solely keeping the industry alive, Billy. I hope you realise this.
I just account for like 95% of the streaming figures in the world, of course. But as well, because with there being so many different services now, it's like it's kind of the same with music being having such regular output now. It's hard to keep up with all the new things that are out, and especially with things coming on Sky as well. Trying to keep track of that too, and things that are actually on terrestrial TV.
Just to finish off this convo, then just one last thing. So we were talking a little bit before we started recording about Succession, because obviously I've been catching up. You're watching it as the episodes of the final season come out, and we were talking a little bit about the difference that it makes having shows released on a weekly schedule rather than the Netflix model of it's all up on there from the get-go. And I just wanted to just to reiterate what you said to me before about kind of this collective viewing experience that we've kind of lost, but I think we need it back. We need to get it back.
Yeah, no, I'm a big advocate for like the weekly episode viewing model, because, and I'm not against a good binge. I recently did Derry Girls in like 3 days in like over the long Easter weekend, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point because it's amazing.
We're gonna do a sitcom episode.
Yes, we'll definitely do a comedy episode, like talk all the classic sitcoms.
I could spend a whole episode talking about Derry Girls, not gonna lie.
Me too. I love that show so much.
Sidetracked. Every time you say Derry Girls, I get sidetracked. Carry on.
Derry Girls. No, I'm guilty of that as well. But so I'm all in favour of a good binge. And it's, especially when there's so much to catch up on now, you do kind of want to, fire through things if you can. But there was obviously no spoilers, but there was a recent episode of Succession. It was the 3rd episode of season 4, and it's not hyperbole to say it's one of the most powerful and impactful episode and gripping episode of television I think I've ever watched, at least in the drama genre. And it was just some gigantic events happened in it, and it was like changed the course of like the entire season. It was like, whoa, what on earth is going to happen now? And just being with everyone, having that collective shock at what had transpired, was a real massive watershed, TV moment, and just being there and sharing that shock with everyone was really invigorating. And also having that discourse and that time to decompress, to unpack all the reasons why the episode and the script and the performances worked so well, and then to collectively kind of bask in the shock and also go, where do we think it's going? What does that mean for the course of the rest of the season? Especially, even more so because it's the final season. it makes it so much better because you build up and your excitement and your thoughts and your predictions going into each episode are so much more accentuated that it makes following the whole season through that much more momentous. And I think particularly for shows like Succession and recently House of the Dragon, there's so much the scripts are so dense and there's so much to unpack in terms of wires crossing with character arcs and power struggles. And you know in one 5-minute scene in Succession, so much subtext can be fired out through a few lines, one conversation, one dialogue between two characters that says so much when you think about it in a macro sense, how it links to other scenes in the series and everything. And having that time to pull it apart and zoom in on those moments when you're not just trying to get through the basic plot by binging the series, I think means you get that much more out of the wider story.
Yeah, I think the excitement and the adrenaline waiting for a new episode of a good show to come out, I think we have lost that a little bit. Yeah. And that discussion, the racing to the couch. I mean, we're still from, our generation was maybe one of the last ones that had to race to the couch because
I remember
something's on. Something's on. Doctor Who usually for us. It was like Doctor Who's on. It's 9. Everybody in like it's a military operation.
Everyone's hurtling over footstools and
exactly.
And sending ornaments flying to get into the living room before the show starts.
Takes me back to the I'm outing myself as a Tumblr girl here, but like the Tumblr days where you'd watch an episode of Sherlock or whatever was on at the time, and then you'd go to Tumblr and there'd be all of this theorizing and discussion and about what's going to happen next and what does this mean and all of that. And I think that's one of the joys of TV is being able to discuss it with people. It's why soaps have stood the test of time. It's not necessarily because we really, really, really want to know who stole the hen from Emmerdale Farm, last week. People want to discuss the drama that's happening and they want to wait and find out what's happened with each character. It's a relationship that you build over a long period of time. And I think we've lost that relationship with, characters, with actors, with this whole, binging culture that streaming has enabled, basically. So yeah, I think it's nice to see some of them going back to the old model of releasing every week. As frustrating as it can be sometimes when I just want to watch the next one.
Yeah, when they leave you with an absolute barnstormer of a cliffhanger, and you just clambering for the next episode. But then when you actually get to the next one, you're like you're glad you waited.
And would something like Breaking Bad have had the impact that it did if it was released all in one on Netflix when it came out? I don't know. I don't think it's weird the time that we're living in now, where a lot of the big shows that I can think of, I don't know how they would fare today. I feel like a lot of them would be lost to the void if they were just put on, which streaming service would suit it best and just left for people to find it.
Yeah, and it would diminish the power of big plot points and big reveals, if you didn't have that gap in time to tease the audience. I watched, me and my parents came to Breaking Bad later, a few years later, and watched it all in one go, and we did binge it. And of course, that wasn't detrimental to the quality of the show because it's one of the greatest TV dramas ever made. But, can you imagine that's that season 5 mid-season cliffhanger, seeing that and then having to wait a year? Can you imagine the simmering like tension and excitement going into that last half of season 5 based off that mid-season cliffhanger? That would have been insane. The hype would have been through the roof.
Yeah, exactly. So we need a show like that, and I don't think there's been one of those for a while. I think Succession maybe is the latest kind of Breaking Bad's ilk, so to speak, where it feels like everybody's watching it, everyone's talking about it, people are still going to be talking about it long after it's finished. I don't think there's been a series necessarily since Breaking Bad, unless you can think of one, where it's had this sort of reception.
No, except for Game of Thrones, no others.
Oh
really.
yeah, my God, I forgot about Game of Thrones. Oh, that little show, that little indie production, Game of Thrones. No one
Little
watched it.
obscure underground miniseries. But still,
Yeah.
not many. Not many, that's the point.
Yes. Let's get on to some reviews, and our first review this week is actually 3 films. We've been talking a little bit about them throughout the last couple of episodes because they've had re-releases at the Watershed. So this is the Three Colours Trilogy, and you said that you're going to keep yourself the time on this.
Yes,
Very good. In your review. So I'm gonna keep an eye on the clock while you tell us what Three Colours is, and tell us all about it. What does it mean? Why should people go and watch it?
Gonna do my best on this one because there's a lot to unpack, but I've been quite disciplined with my notes, so we'll see. So the Three Colours Trilogy, for their 30th anniversary, have been remastered in 4K and re-released a week apart throughout April as part of this anniversary, and both at the Watershed and wider and around the country. 3 films, Blue, White, and Red. French films directed by Polish director Krzysztof Kieślowski. And they're probably internationally his most famous piece of work. He's also known for the Decalogue TV series and The Double Life of Veronique, but the Three Colours Trilogy is kind of his magnum opus, as it were. And these films they've always fascinated me because of the pedestal they in the annals of world cinema that they have, but also because their exact thematic underpinnings on my viewings of them proved somewhat ambiguous and elusive. I was always, when I first watched them at the first year of uni, I didn't feel like I had a full grasp of what they were trying to say. Not in a bad sense, but I just thought there was so much to unpack. I felt like a couple of years later, with even more cinematic knowledge and coming to them with fresh eyes, being familiar with the plot, I felt like I was going to get so much more out of them. And I really felt like I did, having seen them again in the cinema. And both, the 4K restoration is gorgeous anyway. And so I felt like it was kind of like seeing them in an entirely new light for the first time. I feel like I have a much greater grasp of their collective messaging now as well, which is wonderful. The central overarching concept is that the trilogy is based off the 3 principal values of linked with the colours of the French flag: liberty for blue, equality for white, and fraternity, or brotherhood, more simply, for red. They are blue, centered around Juliette Binoche's Julie, who loses her son and husband in a car accident at the very start of the film, and instead of really traditionally grieving, she basically casts away all her possessions, sells their house, and basically moves away and starts an entirely new life, as though she's trying to run away from any sort of trauma or things associated with this event. Although human connection, when she's trying to avoid it, it's a task easier said than done. White revolves around a Polish guy called Karol, working in France, who is married to a girl called Dominique, played by Julie Delpy, famous for the Before trilogy. She divorces him after 6 months of marriage due to him being impotent, and then basically looks into getting him deported and sends the police after him by staging a fire at their home, and painting him as this evil, villainous character, and basically ruins his entire life. So he then goes back to Poland to try and rebuild his life and just start a new existence, and maybe one day rekindle that spark with her. And Red focuses on an aspiring model who accidentally hits a dog in the middle of the street in her car, and then takes the dog back to the address on the collar, and encounters a retired judge who's kind of recluse and is actually surveying and spying on his neighbours through a kind of wiring telephone system he has. He sort of listens in on their conversations, and she objects to this, but also grows to form a strange relationship with him, a friendship of sorts, and sort of unpacks why he does this. And so very fascinating, kind of interesting, intriguing central stories. And Roger Ebert famously described them as the anti-tragedy, the anti-comedy, and the anti-romance. And that's certainly true, as the death of Julie Delpy's husband in Blue, it frees her from the shadow and suffocation of living in the shadow of her husband's musical fame. The screwball-esque scenarios that happen in White, they have this strong underlying pathos and bleakness due to how negatively Carol's wife treats him. And Red kind of refutes a cliched romance between the model Valentina and the judge in the interest of placing importance on a pure and warm platonic connection rather than a romantic relationship. Upon watching them all again and being able to see the thematic threads connecting, more obviously this time around, to me, they are about people in a singular sense and in a larger societal sense, losing touch with their roots and their identities and those formative parts of their life who make them who they are through these seismic life changes or mistreatment at the hands of traumatic relationships. In Blue and White, we see a woman attempting to escape grief by cutting ties with everything associated with that past life, and a man forced out of a bond he had with someone, then fixating on that past relationship and attempting to reclaim it, or perhaps his intentions are more complex than that. This then makes Red such a powerful conclusion to the trilogy because the focus is so directly put on the power of beginning a new connection with someone who, even if it begins through the most unlikely and strange and arguably warped of circumstances. To me, the real genius of the Three Colours Trilogy is this central connection that Kieslowski forms between the universal, the societal, and the personal, the humanist in a very singular sense, and the political. Kieslowski's work here has been described as having great cinematic reach. And what that means to me is that he has such pinpoint character precision in terms of relaying these really potent and emotionally enveloping life events and showing us, the audience, how the protagonists are experiencing them. But he incorporates symbols, side characters, and metaphors to work in this wider social angle, which, I mean, there's not enough time to delve into all those details, and I wouldn't want to spoil them. But some of the side characters and the wider story implications they have in how the protagonists, say in Blue, Julie, how she reacts to them, it's very telling of what that film in the trilogy is trying to say about French society. In a filmmaking and narrative sense, there's a lot to love about each film individually as well, not just taking them as a collective whole. Blue has this beautifully cool and airy cerebral poetry as we are brought into Julie's mindset, but also has this rustic quality to the sequences of her building her new life, as though she's stripping away the glamour and the facade of a kind of a second-hand celebrity existence because of her husband's fame. White has this straight-faced earnestness and bluntness that works really well with the blackly comic dilemmas that Carol finds himself in. But in its final sort of act and final third, it layers on the pathos, and it's really thrilling and yet quite melancholic in its climax. Its final scene is maybe my favourite scene in the whole trilogy. And Red finally combines this very light tinge of foreboding atmosphere with a deeply passionate and seductive generosity in its exploration of a burgeoning friendship and the interesting tensions and shifts and emotional things that come with that. Upon my first viewing a couple of years ago, I think Blue was quite decisively my favourite, but upon rewatching and gaining a greater sense of how they connect together as a holistic piece, I've swayed more towards the general consensus that Red is in fact the strongest of the three. I think it's the most complete and front to back. I think it's the most complete front to back narrative and the most complete distillation of the trilogy's ideas, whilst also having the poetic and insightful writing and exploration of the series themes, the most so, I think, of the three films. And I still love Blue for Juliette Binoche's nuanced and hard-edged and sensitive performance too. White is generally the one that more people are torn on. I agree that due to its more comedic earlier passages, it doesn't quite have the dramatic impact of Blue or Red, in the earlier portions of its runtime. However, I do think the comedy works as it brings a welcome tonal balance to the trilogy, so it's not just dour bleakness and grief throughout the whole film, or really heavy philosophical character drama. And then it also, as I mentioned earlier, it really comes together in that final third for me. The subversive character motivations and twists that happen there are as powerful as any other moments in the trilogy. And White reveals and changes in its characters' motivations in its final moments that recontextualize a lot of earlier decisions. So I feel like White was about as rewarding a re-watching experience as Red was. So yeah, there are, and this is just other really fine details, like the unfinished classical symphony that Julie's husband left behind in blue, that was to be played by several world-renowned orchestras for different countries. How that weighs on her, and there's this expectation that it should be finished for the good of the worldwide audience and bringing together nations. But what feelings will that unlock for Julie? And there's that pertains to that idea of expressing or functioning on a singular personal level, but also if we function better as individual people, we will function better as a societal whole. And I think Kieslowski weaves these huge humanist and ethical and philosophical ideas into deeply intimate character dramas and psychological drama with total mastery. I think anyone who has a keen interest in French or Polish cinema, or just indeed world cinema, or really thought-provoking character dramas in general, should absolutely seek these out. I would give them all three of them really solid A's. I think they're classics of foreign cinema, and they're also being released on a new 4K remastered, very plush, lovely Blu-ray set that I think I will drop the money on at some point. And yes, I would highly recommend that people seek these out.
They certainly sound absolutely packed with information. I feel like the kind of films that it doesn't matter how many times you watch them, you're gonna see different things in them every time.
Yeah, they're so intricate, you'll pick up on new things each time you watch them.
So from fairly highbrow, cinematic masterpieces to The Evil Dead. This is.
What are you trying to say?
Hey, I'm
Horror
not saying.
classics.
Hey, listen, I'm not saying anything. I'm so bad with horror. I can't possibly comment. To be honest, I have no leg to stand on. I am a wimp. And I even messaged you to say, I'm not seeing Evil Dead. You can take Evil Dead.
Yep. I'll leave that one to you.
I watched the trailer, and even that freaked me out. So that was quite enough for me. This
It's a full-on trailer.
It is. It is. A lot happens in that trailer. This is another addition to the Evil Dead franchise. We famously had quite a gory, full-on reboot of the Evil Dead. Is it the first Evil Dead film? I can remember there was the same thing with the vines that happened.
Yeah.
In it, so that we had that reboot. It was received fairly well from memory, and now we've got Evil Dead Rise. So what's its connection to the original films, first of all? So why is it an Evil Dead film, and then what did you make of it?
So its connection to the original trilogy is that it kind of in general has the same sort of plot machinations. It actually has a prologue that kind of starts off in a sort of a cabin in the woods style scenario, to sort of nod back to the original setting of that trilogy with Bruce Campbell and directed by Sam Raimi. But then after that sort of prologue that nods back to the heritage, we are transposed to a very sort of grimy, industrial, more modern setting. This falling apart, decrepit, deteriorating apartment building that the family that the action will center on is situated in. And we get the same real plot machinations. That there's an earthquake that destabilizes a hole in the apartment building, and some of the kids go down into it, and they find sort of crucifixes and sort of devilish imagery and writing and scrawling on the wall, and they find this book that has teeth with some incantations. Although I did really appreciate one of the kids is an aspiring DJ, and he finds some vinyl recordings, and he puts them on his decks to try and see that you would normally mix songs on, and then that spurs the incantation, which then calls upon the demon that's shown in those very famous propulsive POV shots that also show here. And there's some kind of there's a chainsaw, there's nods to the vines, but except now they're the elevator wires, and there's just several kind of like knowing Easter eggs and plot elements that you will know from prior Evil Dead films, but they're delivered in this really fresh way that again felt like discovering the franchise and its joys again for the first time. One of the main draws of the Evil Dead is that it has this maniacally mischievous blend of extremely outlandish and vicious gore, and the blackest of comedy that's placed dead center in these really horrifically gruesome scenarios. And there's this kind of great pleasure in daring the viewer to lean in closer and wonder if there's, if there is a ceiling to how high the brutality of get. To which, of course, the answer is no. And I didn't dislike the 2013 remake. I wasn't crazy about it. One of the things that didn't quite work for me about it was that it piled on the grime and the darkness without finding either the humour that made the original so wildly entertaining or making it genuinely frightening. There's a fairly feeble and perfunctory addiction and brother and sister angle in it that didn't really work. The characters were just so thinly drawn and vapid that it kind of made the gore and the carnage really meaningless. There's nothing in theory wrong with, playing a traditionally comedic franchise very straight and going for the darkness, but what you then have to do is you have to make it legitimately frightening and squirm inducing, which, outside of, kind of as some of the gore in the Evil Dead remake, it didn't really do that for me. However, Evil Dead Rise is an entirely different story, and I have to say it's totally after the disappointment of the 2013 version, this new reboot has totally reignited my love for this series. It's important to say going in that it doesn't completely embrace or hark back to the original series' intent focus on black comedy, but there's just enough devilish humor and kills and demonic one-liners that a long-time fan like me will get a kick out of. It's nice to see that, but Rise does lean more heavily into the horror as the 2013 version did. The difference is this time it is scary and it is disturbing. One of the really exciting things about this is that Rise doesn't just make you squirm by ruthlessly throwing gore in front of your face, as would be very easy and kind of lazy and wouldn't take a lot of effort to do. It has a lot of like filmmaking finesse behind it. It has some really great stylistic flourishes in the direction that help create more tension in the story alongside the really visceral gore. Intelligence where the camera work will reveal two threats, coming from two different places where the characters are only aware of one, but we as the audience can see one is approaching from like a blind spot. Reflections in windows and vents, subtly revealing creatures that sneak upon the characters. Snorri cam shots, those shots when, a camera is like placed on the front of a person as they're running and it's really disorienting and wobbly. That injecting urgency into the film. There's a great moment involving the reduction in perspective you get from looking through a peephole and how that disorientates us as to where threats are originating and how they pass by the peephole and how they're kind of two people interacting on either side of it. That's a very entertaining sequence. And despite how relentless some of the violence is, it doesn't have this wryly winking tone that would make the proceedings really unpleasantly sadistic. The practical makeup, it's really tastefully touched up by CGI to give the possessed characters a really menacing demeanor, and the performances are fantastic. Their demented smiles and menacing demeanor and sadistic one-liners are, and their aggression are really heart-pounding. The possessed mother, is one of the most hair-raising horror movie villains I've seen in quite a while. And I'm not easily shaken by horror films, but there were some moments in this that genuinely had me like gripping my seat tight because I was like, oh, I was genuinely worried for suspense riddled. The horror also has this really combative physicality to it, where these really forceful close-ups and brief but rapid edits and frantic handheld camera moves punctuate these intimately vicious physical scraps that really do have you on the edge of your seat, and you feel the violence and the impact of it that much more palpably. I would say the blood levels are a bit more toned down than they were in the 2013 version, but because of that rigorous physicality to it, I felt the impact of it that much more, and it made me squirm that much more. And I really like that the filmmaking and performances add that much more visceralness to the horror. I've talked in the past about how intelligent orchestration of an action sequence in terms of the geography of its setting can really elevate the gratification you get from a big set piece. And Evil Dead Rise does this brilliantly. The more industrial and decaying texture of that apartment building, it feels freshly distinct from the cabin in the woods setting of prior entries. But it also feels that much more enclosed and claustrophobic because, in a wood you can run places, even if, there's a lot of distance. You can't run through a concrete wall. It feels that much more, of a pressure cooker environment. And when the action kicks in, the film essentially it fluidly and with terrifically propulsive pacing, it moves through what is essentially one extended set piece. And it utilizes the vents, the main hallway, the blocked off doors and broken elevator shafts and shutters in a parking garage and winding angular corridors to keep the action moving and constantly changing in a really exciting and gripping way. And in that way, it's really smart from a structural perspective as well, because it lays out this very grounded and fractured and simmering family drama to get us on side with the cast early on, and we emotionally invest in them just enough that we care, and that there's a subtextual edge to the chaos, but we don't beat around the bush too much, and we get to the carnage we all came to see in an Evil Dead film in very good time. And once the madness starts, it's then positioned in a state of constant escalation that keeps the tension rising and us wondering how much chaotic things can get, and which piques our interest as it barrels through its super tight 93-minute runtime. I was very impressed with this. I had an absolute blast, and it showed that, you know, even with some familiar elements, you can deliver them in a fresh way. And, you know, I'd had a very, very busy week at work, and some gnarly demon kills were exactly the vibe I was wanting, and it delivered that with some really good filmmaking craft in there as well. So I was A- for Evil Dead Rise, very much looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the review, but not one I'm going to be checking out in a hurry. I'm sorry.
Not quite sold it to you.
Unfortunately, not. But moving on to something a little bit lighter. So this was our suggestion this week, and this was from Pat again, who I feel that we should just have him on the show. We should just have him, our inbuilt suggestion man.
I'm sure we'll have him as a guest at some point.
This was to celebrate World Earth Day, which was yesterday. I asked for nature and climate related suggestions. It could have been fiction, it could have been documentary. We had some really good suggestions. I mean, I put Wally on the on the Instagram because to me that is the best possible film about climate change that there has ever been, and people can fight me on that fact.
It's great.
But this is a documentary. It's called Treeline. It is available on YouTube, and I think we had some differing opinions on this. So you go first. What did you make of Treeline?
I loved it. I thought it was really, really moving and very cinematic for a documentary made by Patagonia. That's not a slight against them, but considering their other work, you know, I wasn't expecting something quite so so robust in terms of its filmmaking craft. But this was wonderful. It's really just about the power and environmental and personal significance that trees have. And I think what I particularly loved was how the interviews and narration are so strongly linked to this very persistent like narrative through line of how we as humans connect with trees and the natural world. You know, the stories and ideas expressed by the interviewees don't speak about the environmental issues in too much of an impersonal macro sense that's, you know, more based around dry statistics or scientific jargon. You know, they're always speaking about them as the true living beings that they are, and you feel that impassioned reverence that the filmmakers have for the trees. And it just talks very, very obviously and very persistently about how we connect to them on a personal level and what they mean for our own lives, and it kind of aligns us with trees and the natural world in a very personal sense, as though they're other humans we can interact with. And I think it did a really good job of elevating the importance of trees that we so readily take for granted. You know, these wonderful reminders of how persistent and adaptable trees are to their landscape, and, you know, title cards and sound bites that remind us they've been present on the earth for far longer than we've ever been. And it also kind of universalizes the topic with its edit and its structure. It kind of really gracefully glides between these sequences of tree ranges in American mountain ranges and national parks, but then you also get them trees popping up in urban metropolises or railways or people's gardens in Japan. And that I like that cultural diversity as well, and in that's also present in the interviewees. And I love the pits with the Japanese tree doctors and priests and their explanation of how trees are worshipped and enshrined as gods in their culture. The score's really gorgeous. It really richly conveys the poetry of the story and the subject matter. It's got these weeping violins and string sections, these glistening and lilting pianos, these ambient echoing soundscapes that have these like ghostly reversed keyboards, but also these brightly glowing chords at other points. I also found the points on how trees communicate with with each other about their feelings, health and conditions, and like the presence of food in a forest, in the same way as like our own neurons in the brain communicate. I found that really illuminating, and and I hadn't really thought about it like that before. And all of these points are given even more power when the really urgent message about deforestation it coalesces in the film's final few moments. You know, where we're enveloped by the personal significance of trees and how important they are in our natural world and what they mean to people early on, which makes us invest that much more. So when they bring in the deforestation stuff at the end, it hits that much harder, and we see how much more relevance that message has. And yeah, in the end, I found it very moving and a great tribute to a very essential part of our natural world.
I liked it. I do tend to struggle with documentaries that feel a bit melodramatic to me, and there were moments where this did that. I think there were bits where there was like, you know, slow motion snowboarders going through the trees, and they weren't really. I understand why they were in there, but they weren't really saying anything that was of interest to me. I was really interested in that first woman when she had that device that could let her see the rings inside the pine, and thought that that could help them kind of understand climate change, because they can see how a tree that had been there for so long had adapted to climate change over its life. And I was so interested in that, and then we didn't come back to it, and it was like dangling a carrot in front of a, or I was just like, but the thing, you just said something so interesting, and I understood that this wasn't, it became apparent that that wasn't what the documentary was about. It was more poetic. It was about, the life cycle of trees, about the impact it has on different people. But it frustrated me knowing that there was something so interesting in there that wasn't explored in, any great depth. It was just like, oh, we're doing this really cool thing that could, change the way we think about climate change. Yeah. Anyway, it frustrated me that, that was there, and that wasn't what the documentary was about, because I was really fascinated by it.
I do agree they could have like called it on the snowboarding footage a little bit.
Yeah, there were a lot of like slow-mo, forest exploring shots, and that kind of side of things, I liked the tree surgeons, I liked the scientists, but the people who just, the strange people who go skiing through forests for fun. That's not something I can connect with at all, and unfortunately there's a large chunk of the film that's dedicated to that, and I'm just like, yeah, I don't know. I thought there were more interesting things to concentrate on, and part of it felt like a bit of an excuse to get some pretty shots. There are some there's some gorgeous cinematography in it, but I just felt like there was more interesting things that it could have said that it didn't, and instead we're kind of fleeting to these different people, and I didn't quite get the thread the same way that you did. Maybe I didn't quite feel the journey. It felt quite disconnected at times to me. It felt a little bit messy, but it was messy in a very clean way, in the fact that it looks amazing. Maybe you forget that it's messy. That was just me. That was just my kind of perception of it.
Yeah, I think because it's a topic with such breadth, maybe I was a bit more forgiving of the fact that it is somewhat structurally loose. And yeah, I do think maybe some narrative like refocusing on certain areas could have, made the messaging, have even more depth and even more power. But I think I love me some poetry on screen, so maybe that carried my interest a little bit more. than perhaps it did for you. But no, I very much like this one. And hey, if it gets people thinking more about the importance of trees,
Hey,
then
I'm all here
that's a win in our
for
book.
people, enjoying the importance of trees. And the good thing about this one is that it's free to watch on YouTube. So you know what, people, go watch it. Tell us what you think. Do you agree? Do you agree with me? Do you agree with Billy? What are your thoughts on this one? Would be
And
really
it's 40
interested.
minutes.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
40 minutes. It's only 40 minutes of your time. That's that's a whole David Attenborough.
yeah, maybe not even quite the length of that. So
No,
no
it's nice and
excuse.
short.
Get on it.
Get on it. Give it a watch. Okay, moving on. We're going back to horror. Why we have to do this? Why so much horror, Billy? Can
There's a lot of
we?
horror out this week. There's a lot of horror out this week.
Why can't there ever be films about like a lamb, like a happy little lamb?
Hey, there was that film last year that was
No,
called Lamb. It
as soon as I said
severely
it,
messed up.
as soon as I said it, I started thinking about that thing, and I was like, no, that's not what I meant. I just want happy times. Anyway, this one's called Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I've heard of this one. I've heard that it's had good reviews. It's an A24 film. So, Billy, what's it all about? Is it worth the watch?
So this isn't technically a new release. It's a couple of years old. I believe it was 2020 it came out. Like we said, it's from the production house Gods that are A24. It's a kind of young adult teenage centric horror slasher comedy. It's about a number of vapid not teenagers, vapid young adults who travel off to one of they're all very upper class, very self-centered and money obsessed and status obsessed, and they head off to kind of like a reunion at one of their very large family homes for a hurricane party, but they all kind of hole up and drink and play party games or whatever, and while the rain and storm is raging outside. And they play this game called Bodies, 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 which is essentially kind of an American version of what we might call wink murder here in the UK, but with slightly different rules. And unfortunately, it turns deadly, and someone turns up dead, and then it's a race against time to find out who is the killer, why is this all happening, and can they all survive till morning. So not the most original premise in the world, and perhaps that's why I kind of steered clear of it for a while, despite the good sort of heritage with the production company behind it. But I actually really enjoyed this, and I watched this with my mum, who's not really much of a horror fan these days, but she actually really enjoyed it too. And I think it's not as full-blooded a horror film as some other slashers. It kind of has a bit more of a thrillery tone in it, but it certainly does have tension and foreboding atmosphere in it, and but it's very entertaining too. Tone wise, it strikes this very fine balance between leaning into how vapid, self-obsessed, and grating the characters are, with this very brash and heightened hip hop centric soundtrack, with all these very kind of borderline obnoxious rap bangers that are sort of kind of alluding to the character's abrasiveness as well. But it also has some more grounded and ominous touches of ambient synth work in the soundtrack, and some more restrained and realistic boots on the ground handheld direction and camera work. And I think if the filmmaking had aligned itself too closely with the abrasiveness of the characters, it would have felt like the film reveled in and was complicit in their toxicity in a really obnoxious and unappealing manner. But actually, the perspective on these very mean-spirited and annoying characters is more passive, and it's passive enough that the film is almost inviting us to laugh at the friction between the group and their selfishness, and also kind of sit on the outside and buy into the tension and the murderous events of the story. And I really enjoyed the fact that the tension and chaos doesn't just immediately explode forth from some random killer or supernatural presence that's like disconnected from the character's issues. A lot of the escalating tension results from the character's petty grievances and narcissism that gradually starts to seep into their conversation. The script is really sharp. It's well written in that sense, because humorous and playful mocking early on, it slowly turns venomous as these kind of small verbal shots are slid into the otherwise rapid fire exchanges between the characters, you'll catch a hint of, oh, that line's got a bit of an edge to it. There's a bit of a personal angle being thrown in there that could cause some friction. And the very tumultuous nature of this central group is judged really well too. Their panic and focus on looking out for their own self-interest, it leads to many entertainingly suspenseful sequences where dialogue is laced with dual meanings and unclear motivations that the characters are all trying to discover or get on top of or one-up each other or discover what people are trying to do. We don't know if a character is taking a situation seriously or not, or if a character is lashing out at another about a past relationship or incident with actual genuine malice or hurt, or if they're just trying to divert the attention away from them because actually they're responsible for the killings. And then this gets ramped up more and more as we proceed. And it culminates in this great sequence that's just a really bitingly funny and like searing verbal slugfest where every like grievance between like 4 or 5 characters is like laid completely bare out on the table, and we fear we're just waiting for somebody to be killed right there and then, despite the fact that many of the killings up until that point have been off screen. And there's also this really hilarious joke about how much work goes into running a podcast because someone's getting the piss taken out of them for it. And he goes, well, you have to set up a Google Calendar and you have to get the guests on and you have to write all the notes. And it's just like, we could certainly relate to it very much.
Did you feel
I
attacked in that moment?
I did feel a bit personally attacked by it, but in a good way. And the tension driving the plot, it works greatly in conjunction with the script's smart subversions of who we think the culprit is, and taking out potential killers one by one. Who you think it might be at one stage is suddenly then taken out of the picture. So you're constantly second guessing yourself and what's going on, and you're left unsure of where it's going. And I might also just add the house, which the film predominantly takes place in, is like bathed in darkness for 80% of the runtime, which really adds to the tension. Because you think the threat and the danger could come from any angle. This was a really good time. It was funny. It was hair raising in parts, and I like the fact that it does have horror elements, but that is that works so well and is the tension is genuine because the character relationships are so well played, and that's good to see that we're not just relying on gore and jump scares for good horror now. You can catch this on Sky. It's on Sky Cinema now, and I'm sure it's probably available to buy on Blu-ray now too. Bodies, B+ for this one. Very good time.
And this last one also looks like a very, very good time. So the last film with Nicolas Cage in it that we watched was The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, which is such a mess, but I loved it in equal measure. It's pure chaos. It just is what it is. Nothing.
It's so funny.
Nothing can compete with it. But anyway, this is a true return for Nick Cage in Renfield, where he plays Dracula. Is it Dracula or just a vampire?
Oh no, it's Dracula.
Okay, so he's Dracula opposite Nicholas Holt's Renfield.
Who is Robert Renfield, who is in the story of Dracula, Dracula's assistant. And I'm sort of long-suffering sidekick / assistant who just constantly wants to get out of having to serve Dracula, and this is kind of like a modern comedic but also horror-tinged spin on that classic narrative. So right off the bat, Renfield does have that one massive thing going for it from a marketing perspective, and that is the 4 words, Nick Cage as Dracula. And you could have told me nothing else about the film other than that, and you would have had me entirely sold on seeing it based off those 4 words alone.
I think I saw a poster for it at work, and I was like, "Yep, seen it." I didn't even care about the plot.
Nick Cage's Dracula has to be watched. Sold immediately, instantly, completely. And to address that like gargantuan elephant in the room, because that's going to be the question that everybody asks first. It's like, what's he like? And he's excellent. He's in great form here. And the thing I found really pleasantly surprising about his performance, because we all know Nick Cage is the king of over-the-top camp. But it's not, it is campy, but it's not quite as campy as I or maybe anyone else thought it was going to be. Obviously, don't get me wrong, there's like plenty of extravagant scenery chewing that we would come to expect from a classic Nick Cage performance. But it's just restrained enough that he still manages to be genuinely intimidating and adversarial as a villain. And that's really good because it gives weight to the conflict between Renfield and Dracula, and it helps us invest in Renfield's struggle a bit more. If I have a grievance with that, I did feel that, even though he's like just a totally magnetic when he's on screen, and is just channeling Bela Lugosi and Christopher Reid in the who played Dracula previously in the best ways possible, I almost felt like it still managed to underutilize his performance slightly. It relegated him to less screen time than I would have wanted, and having a fairly weak supporting cast to take up the mantle, who was significantly less interesting, doesn't help that. Awkwafina, who I'm normally a really big fan of in Shang-Chi, and particularly The Farewell, which she's wonderful in, she's really, really miscast here. Her brand of like blunt force humor doesn't work with the camp of the story here at all. And she has like her chemistry with Nicholas Hoult is like non-existent. It's like there's just nothing there. As much as they're trying, bless them, it just doesn't work.
They do seem like a bit of a weird combo.
Yeah,
like just in my head, I can't quite see it.
Yeah, and I kind of felt that going in. I wondered if I remember seeing her in the trailer and going, she seems a bit too kind of, a bit too like self-aware and a bit kind of like, what the hell's going on here? It felt like she was, a bit too outlandish in that aspect, and a bit too kind of everyman-esque, maybe, or everywoman-esque to really embrace the camp and ridiculous nature of the story. I did like, the zany and winking homages to the old Dracula film starring Bela Lugosi, and coming from that very vintage Hammer horror period that kind of like set the tone in the film's introductory scenes. They set it up as being this fun satirical jab at classic horror tropes by placing the vampire horror movie story in this AA meeting, toxic relationship comedic context. And I like that on paper very much, and that intrigued me about watching Renfield. But I think it largely fails overall because the main issue to me is that there's a pretty major identity crisis going on at the core of Renfield. It feels as though it's trying to earn its stripes in multiple different genre approaches and doesn't particularly exceed at any one of them. It presents itself at the outset as this self-referential comedy that mixes a subversion of a classic horror story with a quite zeitgeisty satire on like a toxic working relationship because Renfield's like, oh, I'm in a toxic relationship with my boss, which going back to comedies like Office Space, that's kind of interesting, especially in this AA meeting setting. But then what unfortunately happens is that the film loses sight of that charming vintage horror pastiche. It dives into the work relationship satire without much bite or sharpness to like the jabs or one-liners or a lot of kind of depth or any kind of insight into that thing that we haven't seen before. And it also kind of tries to squeeze sentimental messaging out of that storyline with the kind of the bond and friendship between Awkwafina and Nicholas Hoult, which of course doesn't work because they don't gel together on screen as a pair. And all of that just read to me as totally unearned and saccharine. And all the while, it actually, strangely enough, I'm no prude, but it takes the horror aspects of its story quite seriously in some scenes, and it bands around all this overly bloody and gruesome violence that isn't like rigorous enough or physical enough as something like Evil Dead Rise to provide like a visceral thrill. And it also just, it just comes across as, whoa, that's just really over the top and gratuitous for the sake of it. Why? It doesn't work with the quirk and camp of the comedy. It feels like, a total mishmash of genres that just rub up against each other in a really ugly and unappealing way. And the emphasis on the action also leaves much of the character interaction and jokes, because there is quite a lot of action in the film. It surprised me how much there was, actually. It leaves a lot of the character interaction, jokes, and plot development feeling very half-baked and underwritten. It does, kind of breeze by at a fairly brisk 90 minutes. And, it's not terrible. There's nothing outright awful in it, but it just it felt like there was so much potential here, and the film tried to just do too much and didn't really focus in on one sort of key filmmaking approach, and it just ended up really leaving it a bit of a mess. Really, I would give this a C plus. I was disappointed, sadly.
I think that you sometimes get this when a film is trying to be a cult classic. You know, cult classics, you can't make a cult classic. Like, you are called a cult classic after years of being ignored, and then the right community finds you and puts you back in the cinema and adores you. And I think that there are, I mean, to me, this film, like, especially from what you've just said, it's trying to be that. It's trying to be that late night, you know, kind of edgy horror comedy that, you know, maybe not everyone's going to love it, but there's going to be a community of really hardcore fans, and we're going to do late night releases, and it's going to, you know, be remembered by a lot of people. But you can't give yourself that title. And sometimes when I think films try too hard, you do get this kind of mishmash of identities, because they're trying to create most memorable moments so that it, you know, gets memed, or it gets, you know, replayed, or you know what I'm trying to say? I don't know if I'm getting.
No, totally. You know, that kind of particular Rocky Horror-esque, uh, you know, cult tinged camp. It has to be organic. You can't fabricate it. It just kind of has to emerge out of, you know, totally embracing the madness. And when you're trying to do this, you know, either force that or, you know, take this scattershot approach between different genres, rather than, you know, embracing one key mad aspect of the story and running with it. Yeah, it just kind of leaves the film feeling, you know, messy and unsuccessful, and not in kind of a quirkily appealing way.
I think true cult classics are made with full sincerity. Like, that's
Yeah.
what makes them cult classics. Like, they can't really be made with a wink and a nudge. That's not gonna, like, solidify cult classic status. It has to be made with, like, this is a deadly serious piece of art. And, you know, that's why a lot of Nick Cage's films are cult classics, because, you know, everyone's taking themselves so seriously in them.
Face Off.
Oh my god, Face Off. You know what? Bring midnight screenings of Face Off. Why has that not
Yes.
happened?
Yes.
But, you know, he's become this cult icon for a reason, and I think it's almost trying, like, even casting him in the role, you can kind of see what they're trying to do. But it's a shame. It's a shame, because it's something that I've been really excited to see. It's you know, unfortunately, just doesn't quite hit the mark that we wanted it to. Okay, and that's everything for this week. Billy, what have we got coming up next?
So next week we'll be covering the Amazon Prime miniseries adaptation of Dead Ringers, starring Rachel Weisz. We spoke about the prospect of it, the announcement of its release in a previous episode, and the critical responses are solid so far. So I'm excited to see a new take on that classic story. We've got the new anime from Makoto Shinkai, who made one of my favorite anime films of all time with Your Name, and a really solid follow-up with Weathering with You. His new film Suzumi is we'll also be reviewing there. I'm excited for that one. We've got a very incendiary and, you know, ticking time bomb environmental activism focused thriller called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which just fantastic title. Excited for that. We have Lea Seydoux' new drama that's had a lot of resounding festival success, I think at Cannes as well. One Fine Morning. And then we also have a very sort of genre fluid, sort of a culturally focused, you know, action comedy. You know, kind of difficult to pin down. It's called Polite Society. It's giving me big Bend It Like Beckham vibes, but also kind of has heist and action elements in it. It's difficult to describe without seeing the trailer, but I'm excited to talk about it.
I've seen the trailer, and my mind kind of went to Bollywood. If Bollywood did Kingsman.
Yes, that's a
That's
great way to describe it. That's
that's
such a
kind
good
of.
way to describe it.
I'm really excited for that one. I think I'm going to go to the cinema to see that, because that looks pretty epic, actually.
I'm excited.
And I think that's everything for this week. So please share the podcast, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, share it on Instagram, give us a follow, tell your friends, and yeah, keep in touch. Tell us what you thought about some of the films that came out this week. We really want to hear what you guys think about the things that we're reviewing every week. Let's discuss. Discussing's the best part.
That's why we do this.
Absolutely. And we will be back next week with another episode. Bye.
Thank you very much for listening. Bye.